Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Journey Without End, Migration from the Global South Through the Americas, by Andrew Nelson and Rob Curran. Narrated by Zac Aleman. Introduction. Exile is when you live in one place and dream in another. Exile is a dream of going back home. In exile, one is possessed by longing, no matter where the exile takes place. The whole world becomes a prison. Neither Calypso's beauty and passionate love, nor a pleasant life on her island could relieve Odysseus's longing for Ithaca. A life in exile is like being condemned in purgatory, a state between life and death, a limbo between here and there. Shahram Khosravi, Illegal Traveler, 2010. It costs about $30 to ride the tourist boat from the Colombian port of Turbo to Capurganá, on the border with Panama. For migrants like Kidane Okubai, who do not have the documents to take the tourist boat, it costs about $550 to take the same ride in the middle of the night, as part of a trans-rainforest smuggler's package. With this boat ride across the heaving Caribbean begins the most treacherous leg of a death-defying journey. The Gulf of Urabá is shaped like a fishing hook, with Turbo on the upswoop near the tip, and Capurganá on the opposite side, near the tie-off. The boats cut through the diagonal, beginning in the brown, silty headwaters of the Atrato River and the rolling sapphire Caribbean. For migrants, it's a rough crossing in an open-topped skiff with an outboard motor, a boat more suitable to carry a couple of fishermen than a dozen passengers, huddled with their luggage. The smuggler's boat offers no refunds when the trip is not completed, although there is an understanding that migrants are entitled to a second attempt if the first fails, as Kidane discovered. On the night of Monday, July 9, 2018, a local smuggler made his second attempt at the crossing with Kidane and about 10 other Eritreans. In Colombia, smugglers often divide the migrants by nationality to make communication easier. Kidane and his compatriots were wearing life jackets of the bright orange variety that slip over the head. As the small motorboat entered the open Caribbean, the waves picked up. Near Capurganá, several hours northwest of Turbo, wave crests are often 10 feet high. The boats take the waves at speed. For the passenger, it feels like an extreme fairground ride, with a rush to the stomach as the boat climbs the face of the wave, then the sensation of floating in air as it reaches the peak, followed by a plunge down to a hard landing. Even the ferry-sized high-horsepower boat that carries the tourists arrives drenched in spray. On smaller boats, lanchas, as they are called in Latin America, the engine's roar often kicks up an octave from the strain of climbing the rolling hills. On the way back down, the engine often stutters as it tries to find purchase, and the passenger's heart does the same. When Kidane's boat stopped, it was still some way short of the beach near the Capurganá harbor. The smuggler ordered his passengers to jump into the sea with their life jackets. Those who did not jump were pushed. They had to swim to shore, carrying backpacks with them. Kidane, who can swim, remembers the boat stopping about 10 yards short of the beach. Some of the non-swimmers on the boat described it with horror as being more like 50 yards. By the time we met Kidane and his group the next day, he and his compatriots, only a handful of whom he had known before Turbo, were drying their clothes on the downstairs railings of a safe house in Capurganá. They were sitting together in an exterior-covered porch near the railings, talking over the near disaster of the previous night. The hotel was not that different to the lodges where European and American 20-somethings were vacationing nearby, a brightly painted clapboard building overlooking a sheltered fishing dock. It was a Caribbean idyll. But the dripping clothes provided a glimpse of an experience as far removed from the tourists' Capurganá as possible. Kidane and his friends were on a months-long journey, but only carried enough clothes between the 11 of them to cover 20 feet of railings. We had been staying at a neighboring hotel when the hotelier, who knew we had come to Capurganá to interview migrants, told us about a group of Eritreans recently arrived next door. We addressed the group across the hotel railing, introducing ourselves as a journalist and an anthropologist. We told them we were writing about the journey migrants from all over the world were taking to the U.S. This prompted a somewhat tetchy debate among the group as to whether they should even talk to us. In the end, about half the group withdrew to talk among themselves around the picnic tables in the common area. A handful, including Kidane and others, came forward to talk. We listened and tried to transcribe, leaning against the top of the railings at times as we scribbled furiously. One pen had to be tossed back into the waterproof zip bag after the ink went faint. We didn't want to miss anything. We divided micro-interview duties. Kidane waited patiently while we interrupted our conversation with him to speak with his friends. Soon, Kidane's friends went back to checking on their clothes and chatting to one another. Kidane, 31 years old at the time, had a short chin-strap beard which he'd managed to keep sculpted even on the road. A face that was handsome, despite being winnowed and washed out by his journey, and warm, if weary, eyes. He projected a calm intelligence. It quickly became clear that Kidane understood what we were trying to do, and saw some value in it. He recognized the power of his story to inform Americans about migrants, and to inform the migrants about the path to the U.S. While others in the group warned him against sharing information, he trusted us as honest brokers. On that first meeting with Kidane, we talked for about 20 minutes. In the coming days, we would follow up on that interview with Kidane informally several times. We exchanged information, and he expressed relief that he would arrive in the U.S. with a contact. When we returned from the trip to Colombia and Panama, we found Kidane on Facebook. We kept in touch via Facebook Messenger. Messenger, alongside WhatsApp, another Facebook app, is the preferred method of communication for the migrants we interviewed, likely because these apps can move with phone numbers and data plans. All they require is a Wi-Fi signal and a cheap phone. Later, we would get to spend one more day with Kidane, a day during which we documented much of his journey, gleaning many of the visceral details that have allowed us to complete this work. Kidane told us that he kept a diary during the trip, but that very private version of his story he has chosen to keep to himself. Kidane is something of a modern protagonist, a character conscious of his role. Even in that moment of crisis in Capurganá, Kidane had the ability to step back and consider his experience. Among the first things he told us was that he graduated with a degree in library science focused on archives. Perhaps it was his background in books that gave him the perspective to recognize himself as a protagonist in a complex narrative, and to drive some of the narration himself. Recounting the boat incident, he seemed more curious about the motive for the boatman's callous act than expressing the anger of a victim. "Maybe he was scared," Kidane said. "Maybe he thought the police were coming." The Camino Duro. In numbers that have increased sharply during the last decade, migrants like Kidane from all over the global south fly to the only nations in the Americas whose borders remain open to them: Ecuador, Brazil, Guyana, or in the case of Eritreans, Bolivia. From there, they travel north by bus, boat, train, plane, and foot to the U.S. border. When we met him, Kidane had already passed through about a dozen countries since he'd left Eritrea 3 years earlier. There's an old name in Latin America for the overland and sea migrant route to the U.S., the Camino Duro, the hard way. It's a journey that's always been hard, but in the past half-decade it's become near impossible. What was always a daunting proposition now tests the limits of human endurance. The chances of people like Kidane being detained, mugged, deported, tossed off a speedboat, or killed along the way are growing all the time. Sexual assault, long rampant in the Mexican section of the route, is now just as prevalent in the Darién Gap. "And what when we get there?" asked one of Kidane's Eritrean friends, a man who didn't wish to be named and who advised Kidane not to trust us. "Prison? This detention center. It's prison, no?" The same man described being fired upon by Peruvian police earlier in the journey. While this man told his story, the pitch of his voice rose as if he were almost giddy at the thought that these things were happening to him. Kidane and his friends knew when they left Eritrea that they were attempting to pass through the eye of the needle. U.S. border policy and diplomatic pressure on transit countries mean the eye of the needle is narrowing all the time. These policies do not deter migrants as intended, but force them onto an obstacle course full of near-impossible challenges, fitful progress, returns and detentions, life-threatening dangers, and unknown risks. If and when they reach the U.S., as Kidane's compatriot rightly suspected, they do not arrive at a destination. Rather, they enter a kind of gulag, an asylum system that criminalizes applicants. It's a journey that recalls the most epic quests and pilgrimages of history and myth, from the wanderings of Ulysses to the California gold rush. This is the way of the vertiginous Andean Pass, the way of the roiling Caribbean Sea, the way of the viper-riddled Panamanian jungle, the way of the forded Guatemalan torrent, the way of the parched Sonoran desert. This is the way of the overcrowded smuggler's boat, the way of the speeding pickup truck, the way of the American icebox cell. For the vast majority of people in the global South, this is the only way to the U.S. The hard way. These migrants are contributing to the changing face of immigration to the U.S. via the southern border. In 2014, for the first time since records were released in 1970, non-Mexicans outnumbered Mexicans apprehended at the U.S.-Mexico border. Although this shift points to the changing economics of Mexico and increase of Central American immigration to the states, it also hints at the growth of people from Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean migrating to the states through Latin America. The proportion of Asian, African, and Caribbean migrants apprehended at the U.S.-Mexico border has gradually increased from an average of 0.2% in the late 2000s to 1.1% in 2011, surpassing 2% in 2017 and 3% in 2018, peaking at 6.9% in 2019. Border statistics further to the south confirm this trend. The same group of migrants accounted for 1.56% of detentions at Mexico's southern border during the 2000s, but 7.28% in the 2010s, even reaching 16% in 2016. Finally, the irregular transit of foreigners, 99.1% of whom are from Cuba, Haiti, or Asian or African countries, crossing from Colombia to Panama grew exponentially from less than 1,000 in 2010 and 2011 to an average of 19,000 per year from 2015 to 2020. The questions of why Latin America and why now are answered by shifts in South American and European politics. In Latin America's so-called pink tide politics of the 2000s, several states liberalized their immigration policy, creating cracks in global mobility regimes rarely open to the world's poorest countries. In particular, Ecuador's 2008 Citizens' Revolution opened the country, if only temporarily, to any nationality on earth, a radical step described by President Rafael Correa as seeking to unmake the 20th century invention of the passport. Ecuador's seemingly revolutionary move was matched by similar gestures of immigration liberalization and regularization in Argentina, Brazil, and Bolivia. At the same time as these American openings, Europe has become increasingly hostile to immigrants. Almost every African and Asian migrant with whom we spoke mentioned weighing travel to the Americas against European options. For many starting in sub-Saharan Africa, it was the horror stories of crossing the Mediterranean or transiting through Libya that pushed them toward the much longer American route. While the opening of South America and increased closure of Europe has drawn attention to the Latin American route, it should not be considered new. Scholars have identified an Ecuador transit route serving Asian and African migrants since the 1980s. One might even look further back to link contemporary migration with the colonial roots of Asian and African forced migration to the Iberian colonies. Although the current increase to Latin America seems to follow the logic of choice, it is equally configured by global inequalities. Setting off from a variety of regions facing a range of unstable conditions, tens of thousands of people like Kidane are taking one of the longest migration routes in history, a journey often measuring 15,000 miles in length. The Camino Duro starts in 100 different places, but the starting points share certain forces of displacement, economic despair, some degree of political instability, and robust migrant smuggling networks. Joining Kidane's group of Eritreans fleeing the authoritarian rule of liberator-turned-dictator Isaias Afwerki are other migrants from the Horn of Africa, Ethiopians, Somalis, Sudanese, Yemeni, as well as Congolese and Ugandans escaping from economic downturns and conflict. We met an equal number of West Africans, particularly people from Nigeria, Cameroon, and Ghana, but also heard of migrants coming from Angola and Equatorial Guinea. Government statistics suggest that nationals of Guinea, Senegal, Mali, Gambia, Togo, Burkina Faso, Mauritania, and Ivory Coast have also made the trip. Since 2015, English-speaking Cameroonians are the most common West Africans on the route, fleeing persecution and civil war of their francophone-ruled homeland. From South Asia, the official story tends to be escape from some form of persecution. Bangladeshis from the Awami League's repression, Indians, mostly from Gujarat and Punjab, from Hindu nationalism, Nepalis from the threats of Maoist militants, Sri Lankan Tamils from Sinhala rule, and Pakistanis and Afghanis from general violence. In spite of their religious and ethnic diversity, in Latin America, South Asians tend to be collectively known as Hindu, regardless of their religious identification, to avoid confusion with the Spanish Indio term for indigenous people. But their reasons and circumstances for entering the journey vary widely, and as we explore, their journeys tend to be costlier, often tapping into smuggling networks spanning continents. Finally, starting from places that are, at least on a map, closer to the U.S., Haitians and Cubans line the Camino Duro. But their journey is anything but direct. Most Haitians come to the route via Brazil or Chile, where economic downturns and anti-immigrant policies have propelled them northward. Cuban presence on the route greatly increased in 2015, amid rumors that then U.S. President Obama would end the wet-foot, dry-foot policy granting pathways to citizenship for all Cubans reaching U.S. territory. Under this policy, the U.S. distinguished between Cubans intercepted at sea, who were returned to their homeland, and those that made it to the U.S. shore, who were allowed to apply for asylum. The Cuban migrants anticipated, correctly as it turned out, that the exception to migration laws would end as relations between the Obama administration and the Castro regime were normalized. Trump, in spite of rolling back Obama's other normalization policies with Cuba, did not restart the immigration exemption. As the U.S. Coast Guard made boat arrivals on U.S. soil nearly impossible, land routes via Ecuador became the preferred route. In 2015 alone, there was an 83% increase of Cuban asylees in the U.S. over 2014. Migrants from these four global regions mix with other mobile people. In the asylum offices of South, Central, and North American countries, South Asian, African, and Caribbean migrants rub shoulders with Venezuelans, the largest displaced nationality in the Americas over the past 5 years, Colombians uncertain about their peace accord, Chinese nationals rumored to use the same routes but through other networks, and, from Mexico northward, Hondurans, Salvadorans, and Guatemalans. For the sake of consistency, our focus remains on those who enter South America and cross the 10-plus borders in hopes of reaching the U.S. As shall become clear, migrants leaving Africa and Asia have a similar experience, and often a very similar route, to those who come from Haiti and Cuba. The length and trials of a migrant's journey are not decided by the physical location of their home, but rather by the location of that home in the global hierarchy of nations. That's because, as we shall show, many of the obstacles on this route were, and are, deliberately placed in the migrant's way. We will show how President Trump and his administration circumscribed this treacherous itinerary for people from what he, in the statement that defined his callous and facile immigration policy, called shithole countries. Extracontinentales, a problematic label. Along their route in Latin America, the migrants are easily identifiable, picked out by their appearance or by the mochilas, small backpacks they travel with, or simply by the size of their traveling parties. Latin American citizens, reporters, and governments often dub these migrants extracontinentales, a label that, much like the U.S. term alien, is politically loaded with an intrinsic emphasis on exclusion. It's a reductive and hopelessly inadequate term that we use sparingly. The word extracontinental has a troubled etymology, with origins in ecology, to discuss invasive species, and in foreign policy, often in reference to extracontinental military incursions of the Cold War era. These uses invoke the xenophobic trope of migrant invasion fitting a Trumpian worldview. Another politically fraught term is refugee or asylum seeker. Most of the people we interviewed sounded like they had legitimate claims to permanent asylum or temporary protection because of jeopardy, war, or deprivation at home. But the term refugee has been stretched by governments in the global north into some kind of litmus test to distinguish between the worthy and the unworthy, economic migrants, on often arbitrary and politically biased grounds. As we struggled with these inadequate definitions, we came to see this book as an effort to put a more nuanced treatment of the extracontinentales and asylum seekers on the border on the public record by documenting their incredible journey. The phrase Global South, as a relatively new one, initially smacked of academic faddishness. As work progressed, it seemed the best general description of the places our protagonists were leaving. Global South is certainly preferable to the Third World or Developing World phrases that long ago transferred from any geographic meaning to the realm of insult. Nothing else seemed broad enough to encompass the range of departure points in a respectful fashion. While Global South is often used, like Third World, to refer to the formerly colonized parts of the globe, it has come to mean much more. Beyond a geographic designation, Global South invokes the shared struggles of those exploited by the racialized and uneven economic development of global capitalism. It is this more conceptual meaning that aligns with our impressions of agency and solidarities emerging from Global South-South migration. We take inspiration from recent turns in urban studies that refuse to cast Asian, African, and Latin American cities as failures of planning, instead recognizing their adaptive responses to the destructive conditions of imposed neoliberalism. What some label Southern or peripheral urbanism are the creative acts of urban residents to build their cities, working from the bottom up rather than using the top-down approach of the state or private developers so common in the Northern Hemisphere. This kind of city-making consists of improvised small acts of self-built infrastructure and the creation of shadow economies. Importantly, it emerges out of struggle and unexpected solidarities. Migration from Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean through Latin America requires the same kind of creative adaptations. The U.S. and other powers have committed formidable resources to slowing mobility on the Camino Duro, and are constantly shifting tactics in the name of so-called deterrence. For the migrant, this journey requires months or years of adaptive struggle. As we shall show, each migrant depends on a network of others taking the journey, a digital and physical network, to survive. How the U.S. policy of deterrence shapes the journey. The leading anti-mobility power in the Western Hemisphere is the United States. Looming large over each border and national set of policies is the externalization of U.S. immigration control. More than any other country in the Western Hemisphere, the U.S. government has an end-to-end overview of this obstacle course and direct knowledge of the lives it claims every day. Instead of trying to lower the obstacles, the best minds in the U.S. Immigration Service have long been applied to raising the bar on existing obstacles and adding brand new ones. U.S. efforts to stop or slow regional migration are certainly not new, but reached new levels under Trump. Our research timeframe, 2015 to 2020, overlapped with Trump's presidency, giving us a front-row seat to the lesser-noticed effects of his anti-immigration policies on the other side of the wall extending far south of the Rio Grande. The Trump administration has deliberately made the Camino Duro even más duro. In the name of deterrence, The U.S. has employed all the bureaucratic and diplomatic resources at its disposal to stop or slow northward migration. They employ obstacles to wear down people's will to exert their human rights. The Trump administration pushed deterrence, we will demonstrate, to an extreme that entered the realm of what the anthropologist Jason de Leon interprets as necropolitics, a concept made popular by Achille Mbembe's studies of how colonial states governed through death. De Leon's research shows how U.S. policy purposefully redirects migrants through the Sonoran Desert, the most treacherous part of the U.S.-Mexico border. This diversion, he argues, outsources border deterrence to nature through the threat of death imposed by the desert. But the Sonoran Desert is far from the only natural barrier exploited by the U.S. Using their influence with countries along the Camino Duro, the Trump administration worked hard to ensure the Americas became an ever more deadly obstacle course. In this most brutal form of deterrence, the U.S. has harnessed the destructive power of natural obstacles and human-made barriers along the route to control the flow of migrants. The migrants face live fire from border guards, robbery and extortion from Colombian and Mexican drug cartels, Nicaraguan curfews, and American manacles. At great altitude, in high seas, and in forbidding jungle and desert terrain, the migrants are constantly diverted to the most treacherous path. But this natural deterrence is anything but natural. At the center of the journey is the near impassability of the Darién jungle at the Colombia-Panama borderlands. This part of the migration route has long been in use, but unlike almost any other part of the Americas of comparable size, the Darién National Park in Panama is about 2,300 square miles. It remains unserved by road, air, sea, or even river. The Darién's reputation for deadliness is arguably the only effective part of the U.S. and Central American allies' deterrence policy. As such, the Darién is wielded in a way reminiscent of ancient practices of banishment. The Roman and Greek empires chose the most inhospitable parts of their dominions for individuals sentenced to banishment. With the globe to work with, the U.S. and allies appear to have chosen the Darién, an area where terrain, weather, dangerous animals, and armed groups are particularly abundant, as the destination for banishment as a deterrence. Due to U.S. pressure on Panama since 2017, crossing the Darién has become even more treacherous, forcing migrants into midnight boat rides and multi-day jungle hikes without consistent guides. When a Cuban migrant, whom we call Armando, stumbled upon the dehydrated corpses of 4 people, including a child, in the Panamanian jungle, he knew the Panamanian authorities were not coming to bury them. In fact, the corpses that often litter the Darién Gap are part and parcel of policies euphemized as deterrence and controlled flow. U.S. pressure and funding built walls of military sharpshooters, walls of exhausted migrants in lines outside immigration offices, biometric data collection, and, most insidiously, walls of bureaucratic attrition. The brutal family separation at the U.S. border was not the only infringement of human rights conventions. Our reporting suggests that migrants are subjected to deliberate delays and slow peddling of paperwork at every possible turn. One particularly horrific example: asylum applicants are required to fill out the U.S. Customs and Immigration Service's I-589 form. One exasperated immigration advocate lamented to us how, under the Trump administration, if a migrant neglected to fill out any of the dozens of fields on the form, even a not applicable field, the application was automatically rejected. Deterrence becomes a spectrum from the visceral brutality of the jungle on one end to the slowdowns and surveillance of migrant control at the other end. The migrants we interviewed on the route told us they knew who their principal antagonist was. They knew that the Trump administration bestrode the whole route, prepared to assail them like the giant mall in Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. They knew that migrants who took the Camino Duro before the age of Trump did not find it quite as duro. But the strategy of the U.S. anti-mobility regime long predates the most recent administration, emanating from both Republican and Democrat presidents. Since the advent of visas, powerful nation-states have used immigration policy as a form of foreign policy by remote border control. In the case of the Americas, the externalization of U.S. policy has followed.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?